Hi, I'm Dr. Rudy Cashman. I'm a wellness teacher. I was a neurosurgeon, neurologist, frankly, for 44 years, but I would say the last 30 years or so, I recognized that the majority of patients that I was seeing, frankly, needed a coach. They needed nothing special except some love, some teaching about how to get well. And this has become a passion of mine, no doubt about it. And you know, I've given a lot of talk on stress and narcotic medications, and especially on proper eating. It's been a favorite subject of mine because about 90%, 80% of the patients that I was seeing needed some adjustment to their lifestyle, and frankly, nothing else. And slowly, of course, my knowledge has increased also. Tremendous amount of reading, a lot of confidence. I read all the famous books, New York Times bestsellers on nutrition, and the relevant research papers. And a book came out just the other day. I found it totally fascinating, and I encourage you to read it. It's called The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. I think it's excellent. I don't agree with everything in the book, and I'm sure you may not agree with everything which I have to say today, because it's my opinion based on my knowledge and the reading and experience I've had treating probably over 40,000 patients, 10,000 operations at least. And it's very interesting. What is she really saying? What I like about the book, she goes in detail. She was a reporter, especially on reviewing restaurants, and she decided, and she gained quite a bit of knowledge, and she became more interested in the field because she had a little problem, frankly, herself. But the review of the history of the chronic illnesses we have and the obesity epidemic which we have, which reviewed in tremendous detail, the best I've read in any book. I've read it 3 times now, and it's very interesting. I mean, our obesity epidemic goes back many years. We're thinking right now Americans are running a 70% obesity rate. It's that way, frankly, across the world, with some countries more than others. Some it's 80 or 90. Some ethnic groups and racial groups, it's even higher. And it is related, frankly, partly due to the genetics, but the whole problem by a long shot is not that genetics. It is the genetic information in the food which they are eating. It has been my thought and that the problem, frankly, is sugar. And frankly, it's the fructose in sugar that's doing it. It's both. Sugar is toxic, but fructose is poisonous. Yes, it's the same sugar. Unfortunately, that's in fruit. 2 or 3 pieces of fruit because the fiber is fine. But the fructose is leading to this obesity epidemic. And the history of this is fascinating. A gentleman named Banting, he was an undertaker in England, and he discovered he was getting sicker and sicker, and he went to see a physician named Harvey, who recommended to cut out sugar and carbohydrates as much as they could, and lo and behold, he started losing weight. Dr. Harvey had learned about it, who was a dentist, from some physicians in Paris, actually, who had run across this, and then he wrote a book about it. And he was told by the Lancet, the British medical journal, that he ought to keep quiet, that he was not an expert. Well, it turns out, actually, he was right. His books became bestsellers, and they went all over the world, so people started paying attention a little bit as to who the real enemy of improper eating is. It became so popular. It was called Banting. People go on a Banting diet. It's kind of interesting to read about that. Our obesity epidemic, frankly, increased tremendously over the years, and it had to do with sugar consumption. We ate very little sugar in years past, but around 1700. So even in England, the sugar consumption, which was maybe 10 pounds a year at best, increased tremendously. Now in the U.S., we're eating 170 pounds of sugar apiece. Then fructose corn syrup came along, which is even worse. We eat about 60 pounds of that, and you can see the problem. But yet, for the last 50 years, you will not believe this, but it's true. It's well documented in this book. For the last 50 years, the American Heart Association, the NIH, the National Lung, Heart, Blood Institute, American Medical Association, Ancel Keys, who I'll discuss in more detail from Minnesota, have been telling us what's the cause of obesity and all these chronic diseases, of strokes and heart attacks and cancer that we're getting, is the fat in our diet. The fat hypothesis, which was proposed by the American Heart Association around 1961. And then Ancel Keys, a physician from Minnesota, got on board, and then it spread, frankly, throughout the world. And for 50 years, they've been telling us it's the fat on our diet that's doing it, when we now know it's the sugar. It's the sugar. But are they coming out screaming at us right now, telling us cut out the sugar, especially the fructose? I also wrote a book called Fructose, the Evil Twin. If you take sucrose, table sugar, it's 50% glucose, 50% fructose. Yeah, the chemical formula is the same, C6H12O6. But so they're twins. They chemically are the same. But one is the isomer of the other. Glucose goes to the liver, 20% used in the liver, 20% in the brain. The rest is used in glycogen in your muscles. But fructose is metabolized totally differently. Goes to the bloodstream, does not increase the insulin level, goes to the liver, sucks up your ATP, your energy molecule, and is converted to a fatty liver. Causes insulin resistance, leptin resistance, inflames our bodies, inflames our vascular system. Our 300,000 miles of blood vessels become inflamed because of fructose and sucrose and glucose, not the fat we are consuming. There are good fats, there are bad fats. We'll review that. But fat is not the major problem. It is the sugar. That's the problem. So Ancel Keys, he lived from 1904 to 2004, and he was a big proponent of the low-fat theory. He's frankly the father of the Mediterranean diet. And let's discuss for a minute what types of fat do we have, because I'll be speaking about, there are good fats and there are bad fats. There are some essential fats. You need to eat some fats. And we have what type of fats do we have? Saturated fat, and that's what they didn't want you to eat. Polyunsaturated fats, which are generally oils. Any oil, vegetable oil, is 100% fat, okay? Then we have monosaturated fats, which is the omega-3s, which are the good fats. Then we have omega-6s, which are the inflammatory fats. So these are essential fatty acids they have to eat. We need some fat in our body because our brain is 50% fat, at least 20% cholesterol in our brain. Every cell in our body, has 70 trillion cells, has some fat in it, the essential fatty acids. Yes, every one of our cells, 70 trillion cells, has some cholesterol in it and has some essential fatty acid in it, omega-3 and omega-6. Before we had a blood and circulatory system, the living things communicated through the fats and cholesterol they had in their membranes, the omega-3s and omega-6s. We are eating a diet today of omega-6, the inflammatory one, versus omega-3, about 20 to 1. We need to be 1 to 1. You notice the title of the show? Our bodies are on fire. Well, how are they on fire? It's because the sugars are inflaming our arterial system, our 300,000 miles of capillaries, and we're developing atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis at an alarming rate throughout this country. Probably 100 to 150 million people, their bodies are on fire from inflammation from sugar. Certainly some of the omega-6s we get from eating a lot of non-organic animal foods, for example, can also be fish raised in a pond because they're fed a lot of genetically modified food products, and that's what we're eating. So fat does have good and a bad part to it, but we need some fat every day. I have two other books with me, and they are fascinating, and they actually told the future, but they get buried by the information from the American Heart Association, from the NIH, from the National Lung Heart Blood Institute, Ansel Keys, and other researchers, because they were so concentrated they did not allow proper discussion and fund proper research. These organizations control the research money. Some research was done, but it was ignored. Sometimes they would not allow the speakers of the other side of their opinion to speak. But let me tell you about these two interesting books. This is by T.L. Cleve. Cleve was a captain in the British Navy, a physician. He published a book called The Saccharine Disease. You can probably find it on Amazon. I'm telling you, it's frankly, it's a Bible of nutrition, because what he said is that sugar and carbohydrates, which are complex sugars, are the cause of most of our vascular disease, cancer. When they studied tribes that didn't eat much sugar, for example, or even the Eskimos who didn't hardly consume any sugar, mainly fat, they didn't get cancer. They didn't even get appendicitis. They had very little bowel disease. It's not till these societies started eating Western sugar products that they became sick. This is a great book, and Dr. Cleve lays the obesity epidemic right at the feet of sugar and carbohydrates. Well written. It's like he wrote it yesterday, but he get buried by the scientists, Ansel Keys, the American Heart Association, and their thought that fat was a cause of heart disease. The heart fat hypothesis, which they carried for, frankly, even till this day. You barely hear them whispering fat was not the problem. They need to shout it off the mountaintops that we think differently about sugar and fats. Another book was written, Pure, White, and Deadly, by Jan Judkin, about the same time, 1950s, very clearly put sugar as a cause of vascular disease, strokes, are inflaming our body, a lot of chronic disease, including cancer. These two great books, frankly, get buried in the literature, but they pointed out the problem to us, as well as we know Banting did, even at the turn of the last century. Then Dr. Atkins came along and wrote some famous books. He was a cardiologist in New York City, treated many patients. He was not as good a public speaker as Ansel Keys was, for example. So if they had a debate, he kind of get buried in the debate because he was a little too tough. He didn't come across very well. And you know, Atkins even today doesn't have a great reputation, because he's being revived, especially in Nina's book here, A Big Fat Surprise, because what did he suggest what did he suggest many years ago? 40 years ago at least, he suggested that sugar and carbohydrates were the cause of obesity and vascular disease. He didn't run great scientific studies, but he treated many patients. He always opened his office for anyone to come in and study what he's been saying. but they never did till many years later. Personally, I think probably even the cover of this book, just to say eat a lot more animal products, a lot more fatty animal products, I think there's a limit to that. I think you need to know where this came from. See, most of these different fats that we've discovered, that wasn't known in the days of Dr. Atkins. Okay, that's new information. It wasn't until Dr. Bang went to study the Eskimos and found the Eskimos were eating a tremendously high fat diet. They were eating blubber and seals, and they didn't get sick, but they didn't quite know why. Then gas chromatography was discovered actually in the 1950s or so, and in the 1970s or so, they started studying the different types of fats, and they realized there were good fats and there were bad fats. And that information then was studied to a great extent. The National Institute of Health also helped promote the fat theory of vascular disease. The McGovern Commission, the government, with very little scientific evidence, also made declarations and public health declarations that cholesterol was the problem. In the cholesterol theory, cholesterol from fat was a cause of vascular disease. Dr. Stephen Sinatra, not related to the great singer, recently published a book, The Myth of Cholesterol. Yes, I read it. That the majority of the cholesterol is not the cause of the problem. It's the very low density LDL. The very low density LDL, when you get your lipid profiles down, a lot of times they don't even study that part. It takes a special test, NMR test, nuclear magnetic resonance test, because the very low density LDL is caused by, what did I say already? You know it now, fructose metabolism in the liver. What causes very low density LDL is not the fat, so you need to know that figure. The rest of your LDL may not mean very much. That's just what you've been taking Crestor for, and there's still certain reasons to take medications, take statins, but the indication is getting lower and lower. The cholesterol theory of vascular disease is collapsing. Matter of fact, they're thinking some of these medications help a little bit, and people who've had vascular disease already, because they reduce the inflammation. Their effect on the LDL may be irrelevant. Again, it's my opinion, but it's out of the literature. So the American Heart Association in 1961 said you don't want to eat saturated fat, but the level of heart disease we had at that time, about 1 in 7 Americans were overweight at that time. 50 years they're recommending not to eat a fatty diet. Guess what? Now 1 in 3 in the United States is obese. And I already mentioned, there are certain ethnic racial groups, 90% obese. There were no Africans that were obese till they were exposed to the sugary carbohydrate foods from the West, like the Bantu Africans, for example. Then they developed stereotypy, where the whole nation would be tremendously overweight. And it was considered a sign of beauty. They'd have buttocks of an unbelievable size. It was not caused by fat they were eating. It was caused by carbohydrates and sugars. It's a sign of beauty. Pictures of that in these books. So that this was promoted for 50 years, it caused a lot of disability, it caused a lot of deaths. And along this line, I'll tell you, if you read this book, you can see they knew it. They knew it. They just didn't allow other scientists. The American Heart Association, for example, received money from Procter & Gamble. That's what really helped found the association years ago. Then Dudley White came along, a big-time cardiologist who turned out to be the cardiologist for President Eisenhower. Let me tell you what happened there. In 1955, President Eisenhower had a heart attack, okay? And that gave Dudley White, who was this cardiologist, a lot of time on the radio, TV, and beginning of TV, and to give talks all the time, newspapers, New York Times, big articles promoting the fat theory of vascular disease. They would pull his cholesterol once a month, and Eisenhower became obsessed about it. And what did they feed him? They fed him margarine, hydrogenated oils, hydrogenated vegetable oils, and as you would expect, his cholesterol never came down. It never came down. Then, in the end, I think he had 10 or 12 heart attacks before he finally died about 12 years later, somewhere in there. And Dudley White, who helped found the American Heart Association, was his doctor, all the time recommending the wrong thing. I realize that we know more now, but like I said, we know more now, we should be screaming from the rooftops as what the correct thing is to do, and I don't hear much of that. Okay? What are some examples of omega-3s? We can get omega-3s. They're good essential fatty acids. You can get it from fish. Olive oil, flaxseed would be good sources. Remember, you need good omega-3s to improve the lucidity of nerve conductions. It has DHA in it, EPA in it, which are terms you need to know. You take them as a supplement. So take a supplement, 1,000 milligrams of omega-3. I didn't say you had to do that, but discuss it with your physician. That'd be a good essential fatty acid. I take that every day. I don't use many supplements. And monosaturated, maybe said olive oil, and trans fats, where we take vegetable oils and add a hydrogen atom and then heat it tremendously. Those are trans fats. Well, why were they used? Because they solidify vegetable oils and they could make things last longer. So they put it in donuts, and they put it inside of muffins, and they put it inside of most of your food products in the market. Yes, like 40,000 food products have in it some trans fat to solidify it, although the laws are changing on this, but they need to, frankly, they're labeled now, should be labeled, but I think they should be outlawed, should be outlawed. So, and polyunsaturated fats are corn oil, cottonseed, soybeans, canola oil, peanut oil, for example. And I already spoke a little about the fat paradox. Here the Eskimos and Indians, for example, and in Africa, the Maasai, for example, they were well studied, and they were eating high-fat diets, had no vascular disease, but this was ignored by Ancel Keys, American Heart Association, the NIH, the MA. They totally ignored that. That these people actually were very healthy. So Ancel Keys also was the one who designed the K rations in the Second World War. The reason they called them K was after Keys, so he got a lot of publicity. He was always in the newspaper, so people tend to believe him. Although none of these things have been well studied. So you have epidemiological studies where you study huge populations, okay? So they're not very accurate because how are you going to control what populations are eating? So it isn't just one factor. Are they smoking? Are they for example, some of the studies that Keys was looking at, he was sending out questionnaires once a year, like the Nurses' Health Study. They sent out a questionnaire once a year, and they said 100,000 nurses in it. You think, wow, that's a big number. But they sent out a questionnaire, very extensive, once a year. The nurse fills it out in great and tremendous detail. But how accurate is that? In many different factors. What are they drinking? What are they eating? How much exercise are they doing? What can they remember they did all year? So you can see that's an epidemiological study, the accuracy of which isn't great. It's clinical trials where you take a group of people and feed them 3 different ways or whatever and try to control it. is more accurate, but that's not easy to do. First of all, somebody's got to fund it. It takes quite a bit of money. But when you get these people lining up on one side of the debate, the fat theory debate, and they control the money, they didn't want to pay for the research of another opinion, especially since, like the American Heart Association was getting quite a bit of money from industry. They even were selling products that would have on it American Heart Association approved. You've seen those labels. They put it on cornflakes, pure sugar. Yeah, those labels are under Frito-Lay, some other labels from it. They were getting money. And the American Heart Association was getting government grants, fundraisers all over the place. I've been part of that. But I remember being part of the board of the American Heart Association, but not a single time at any of the meetings I was at did they discuss what the cause of heart disease was. Never brought up. Never brought up. And very interesting, isn't it? It's a association of huge fundraisers. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars they raise every year. But how much education have they done out there and say fat is not the cause of heart disease, it's sugar? Have you seen an ad? I've not seen an ad. I think the time has come. The time has come. So another cardiologist, Jeremiah Stampler from Chicago, a cardiologist, joined Ancel Keys, and these guys worked together and promoted this to great extent. And Nina Teichholz went and interviewed him, but he found him to be extremely opinionated, strict, very one-sided, not open to any discussion. And obviously he was sincere in his beliefs, and she spoke to him even in his 90s, and he didn't seem to be open to any type of discussion. A lot of these people are ruthless, arrogant. If someone stood up and proposed an opposite point of view at these nutrition meetings, they'd shout them down. They bring in tall people, and as soon as you finish talking, bang, they scream at you. These scientists said so. It's right. It's right in this book. Don't believe me? Read the book. It's right in there. And interesting enough, you know, we're speaking about cholesterol and causes of disease. A Jeremiah's last name spelled Raunski, studied eating eggs. He would eat eight eggs a day and did it for a few weeks, and they checked his cholesterol. You know what happened? It went down, not up, it went down. That's well known. He published some other papers about it. Yeah, he was eating 8 eggs a day. I don't recommend that, okay? I don't recommend that, but, and one guy is not a study, but he did do other studies, and it brings up an interesting point. And what are fatty acids? They're long-chain carbons with then hydrogen atoms coming off, and then they have bonds. If they're monosaturated, they have one double bond. They're polyunsaturated, they have many double bonds. Just to discuss the chemistry a little bit, you don't need to know that. Keyes was more interested in total fat and not the type of fat. This was a big mistake. In the beginning, that wasn't known. I could go along with it, but later on, remember with gas chromatography, we know that different types of fat, and Ancel Keys didn't pay attention to that. Ancel Keys is famous for the 6-nation study and the 7-nation study and the Mediterranean diet. And he toured throughout the Mediterranean. But he studied 22 countries, okay, statistically. Got a lot of money from our government, $200,000 a year. In those years, that was a lot of money. And studied that, but when he took the report, he reported only on 7 nations. Not the 22. When you put the 22 in a graph, and I've seen him, it does not support the fat theory of heart disease. Yeah, it does not support the fat theory of heart disease. That's in many books. You can read it in Nina's book. Very interesting and a big mistake, because obviously it's killed a lot of people, made a lot of people sick. And even today, who's screaming off the rooftops about eating correctly? So an Italian in 1999 studied the 7-country study. Remember I mentioned the 7 countries. Keyes had published before the 6-country study. And he thought the correlation was much stronger to sugar, 0.82. Remember, 0.1 is a perfect correlation. So he said the study actually proved sugar was the cause of vascular disease. It was incorrectly reported, and he published a paper on that. So that was very interesting. And the problem in these trials, these clinical epidemiological trials, when you go to the meetings, depends on who controls the meeting, who allows people to be head of committees, who approves the research thing. And they'll even gather 600 scientists, and there may be 50 of them that don't agree with what the consensus of the others is. They won't allow them to speak. They won't give them research money. And after a while, they don't answer the phone calls, and they're totally ignored. And that happened. That happened. And when our health is at stake, after all, we are physicians, providers, researchers, honesty is critical. It's critical. It is critical. And that was not taking place here. So about 1970, the recommendation that fat was the cause of heart disease was the gold standard of treatment. It was the gold standard of treatment, believe it or not. And Keyes' picture was on the cover of Time magazine, and in 1961, they called him, I saw the cover of it, they called him Mr. Cholesterol. So remember what I said, though, the theory that cholesterol, the cause of vascular disease, is going down. It's going down. Jane Brody, New York Times reporter, was a big proponent. She even eventually wrote a huge book in how good sugars and starches are. Eventually that was published. It was many, many pages long. Well, she was just wrong. She was just wrong. And it had extravagant worldwide publicity. And so it's selection bias, no proof. These scientists accepted as proof statements, but didn't scientifically really review the studies. Matter of fact, if you have an idea on something, I have an idea on something, you know what the best way to prove that is true? Do studies. Recommend studies yourself that might destroy your own theory. When you're doing that, you're a scientist. Yeah, and if you can find, nobody can think of anything to destroy your theory, and if it's simple, probably it is the truth. Most things that are proven to be true are simple. They're not complex. They're not complex. And that's been the experience of scientists. So there's selection bias. A man named Ahrens, who discovered the gas chromatography we spoke about earlier, he was a big pusher of the sugar theory of cause of vascular disease. But the nutrition societies, frankly, backed these American Heart Association, the NIH, the McGovern Commission. They backed them greatly. They got involved. They said fat is the cause of vascular disease. I don't hear them saying right now that maybe they were wrong, and they could reverse diabetes and vascular disease. Franklin House, Dr. Furman, Dr. Esseltine, myself, Dean Ornish, we all think you can get rid of type 2 diabetes in a couple of weeks. We know it. We have done it. And people need to try it. I just gave a talk on preventing, stopping, reversing type 2 diabetes last night, because everyone who has type 2 diabetes has vascular disease. And it can be stopped, prevented, and reversed by eating nutrient-dense diet and avoiding sugar. Some fat, we all need some fat. If you eat some fat, your blood sugar is not going to go up. But you eat some sugar and fructose, your blood sugar is going to go up. So how do you get rid of type 2 diabetes? Not that hard. Not that hard. The Framingham Heart Study was started in 1948, and they reported after a few years that indeed cholesterol was a cause of heart disease. But I tell you, another 15 years went by, they changed their mind. They were wrong. At least they admitted 30 years later. The predictability of cholesterol level, not so good. But remember, though, that when you get your fats checked, get the very low density LDL. Insist with your provider this is what you want. I had a very close relative recently had it checked, and they didn't order that very low density LDL, but I gave them a piece of paper. I wrote it out for them. Now they had it done. 3 days later, I don't have a result, but we'll see. And because of the Eisenhower publicity and White, Dudley White, the government funded the American Heart Association. They got on the cholesterol bandwagon. It turned out to be a heart mafia, frankly, the heart mafia. The National Lung Blood Institute, all the government founded all these because of the publicity, but their theory on vascular disease was wrong. So then remember we talked about hydrogenation of vegetable oils, and we thought they were healthy for a while. And since about 1900, there's been a tremendous increase in vegetable oil consumption in the United States. I looked at a graph. It looks like this. But remember, vegetable oils are 100% fat. And if you hydrogenate them, hydrogenation of oils causes your LDL go up and your good HDL, the heavenly cholesterol, goes down. That's the one that cleans your arteries out, goes down from hydrogenated vegetable oils. So vegetable oils are not your friend. Incidentally, papers have come out that vegetable oil consumption causes increasing cancer rates. That's been shown 2 or 3 times now. It may not be the final word, but it's out there. It makes you very nervous. And so vegetable oils really became king of the kitchen. They were highly recommended. The American Heart Association, one of the offices, matter of fact, was used on a Crisco advertisement, and is recommending vegetable oils. Oh yeah, that's a true story. Of course, they were paid for it. So tremendous increase in vegetable oil, and there was Mazola oil, for example, was the one used very commonly, recommended by our societies. And in those days, we had Crisco and crackers and muffins, and then soybean oil was the biggest one. That has increased tremendously since 1909 to 1999. I mean, the graph looks like this, but it's 100% fat, okay? And it has some inflammatory factors, omega-6 in it. The monosaturated fat, the olive oil, has omega-3, anti-inflammatory. You don't want to use a lot of it because it's 100% fat. What do you want to live on? If you're cooking, and I suggest you learn to cook, I think it's really a great habit. Blood sugar solution, Mark Hyman, he recommends, and he does himself, learn to cook. If, for example, he would recommend sauteing some chicken or something with a tablespoonful of olive oil. Dr. Furman say use water, just to, for healthy eating, to see that, well, we all need some protein, but we can get it from plants. I mean, plant is full of protein. Matter of fact, 100 calories of broccoli has more protein in it than 100 calories of beef. Yeah, it's in the books. It's true, but you got to eat quite a bit of broccoli. You got to eat quite a bit of broccoli. And matter of fact, the American Heart Association in '61 said we should use oils about 5 to 10% of our calories, and said it's good for the heart. I mean, ridiculous advice. And I hope they stop recommending it now. And but these food companies gave the American Heart Association a lot of money. And so then hydrogenation, when it proved that was not healthy, was we encouraged people to use vegetable oils themselves. But the trouble is the good vegetable oils, which might be palm oil, coconut oil, have been so disparaged by our food companies because those oils came from foreign countries and we did not want them to import them. So we got to the point that Congress even got involved when to write laws against it, and there was so much publicity, Americans stopped using them, but they were the healthier fats. So when the other vegetable oils were outlawed, we had a problem. We could have used some coconut oil or olive oil, because we now know that saturated fat is not quite as bad as we think. Obviously, if you're overweight and you're eating a lot of oils and a lot of saturated fat, you're going to get bigger. That's not exactly what you want. But what I'm saying is, if you eat some fat, your blood sugar isn't going to go up very much. It's when you eat sugar, your blood sugar will indeed go up. And a great deal of Crisco was used years ago, and actually it wasn't quite as bad as the name we gave it to eventually. A couple of studies were done by NIH. They wanted $1 billion to study the difference between what's the best diet for heart disease, but then they decided, well, we'll spend $250 million, and 2 studies were formed. One was called Mr. Fit, which was run by the cardiologist from Chicago that we spoke about earlier. And that study really came out a wash. It really, they didn't follow them long enough, and no recommendation could be made off of that, although the cardiologist from Chicago said, oh, it proved the fat theory. So you can always call it something else when detailed studies indicate that was not correct. And then we speak about the McGovern Commission, the government commission, Senator McGovern Commission, who didn't have all the scientists on the committee, and the guy that wrote it up wasn't even a scientist. And again, back to fat theory of heart disease, which was completely wrong. And then the other study was done by NCAP, the cholesterol, the National Cholesterol Study, and that frankly proved very little and did not prove the fat theory of vascular disease either. So the scientific proof was missing. And but the American Heart Association rode the profit wave of refined carbohydrates, and the Heart Healthy labels, which they threw on refined sugary foods like cornflakes, and they were getting paid for that. Kellogg's Frosted Flakes had the American Heart Association label on it. That's good for your heart. Low-fat Pop-Tarts also was another one. They get money for that. And the Honey Nut Cheerios was another one. And all of which was promoting bad health. Vascular disease is caused by sugar. It's caused by sugar because of the changes that it causes in the liver. It's not caused by fat, although certainly if you're eating animals that have the pesticides and herbicides and they're fed on fat products, and you eat them that are not organic, you're going to get omega-6 and you're going to inflame your vessels too. That's definitely part of it, but that's not the main thing. Sugar is the main thing. For example, if you're looking at yogurt, they eliminated the fat from most of yogurt. Well, that was good for you. What's got most of the yogurt you're eating today? It's got sugar. That's not what you want. So Greek yogurt appears to be the only one that still has significant fat in it. And Jane Brody from the New York Times was a very influential individual promoting the fat theory in the newspapers. And she wrote a book in 1990 called The Good Food Book, Living the Carbohydrate Way, 1990. Can you imagine the amount of damage that caused? Can you just imagine? Has she turned around now, wrote another book to let us know that she was wrong? No. And I think she needs to do that. I think she needs to do that because this is hurting a lot of people. Let's speak about Dean Ornish a little bit. You hear about him quite a bit. But good 25 years ago, he studied patients, and even with angiograms. It was not a big study, though. It was a little study. And what he has promoted all these years, and I think most of what he's saying is correct. But he's recommended nutrient-dense way of eating, which Dr. Furman also, to eat foods of color, maybe add mushrooms to them, and onions which don't have color because they're full of vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals. Low fat, he recommends low fat as low as 10%, which I think is a bit too low. his studies were not huge. He was an excellent public speaker, though, and he would debate Ancel Keys on TV on occasion, and he was just a great public speaker. Him and he debated Dr. Atkins too, and he was a much better speaker than Dr. Atkins. So on TV, you know, Atkins kind of get buried. But remember, Atkins said, get away from carbohydrates and sugar. Atkins was called a fraud by many people. And I may have even quoted as being said by somebody else. I think Atkins is being rehabilitated here. Not to the extent of those animal products, but he was against consumption of sugar and carbs that cause advanced disease, and we got to agree with that. So Ornish is a high nutrient density, and with the angiograms he proved some reversal of vascular disease, but I think personally he was too hard on fat. I read Dr. Furman's book, Eat to Live, very famous, a friend of mine. Incidentally, I beat him in tennis twice in a row. And a very good way of eating. He will even in his books, because I checked and I thought maybe he's too tough on fat. No, he says you can eat up to a 30% fat diet. Most Americans eating 40. So Dr. Furman, I think long time ago, because he's really up to date in the literature, he has a great website too, incidentally. As long as you're eating some of the good fat, you know, organic farming type things, fish from Alaska, not off a farm where they've been fed genetically modified corn, for example, we need essential fatty acids, and we need a little more than that. So he's not against fat. So, but Ornish, who recommended complex carbohydrates, which I do to a point, as long as they're complex, haven't been stripped of their fiber. The two were a little bit opposite end of the poles, but they were both getting some people well. But it certainly is upsetting Ornish to listen to Atkins talk about eat any certain amount of fat and steak you want to eat. And even Nina Teicholz has some ribs on the cover. I wish she hadn't done that, because I don't, especially if it's not organic. These fats have omega-6s in it, although the history in her book is just tremendous. She really researched the history, met all these people. And Walter Willett from Harvard, who had a lot to do with the nurses' health study, the Framingham heart study. He looked at nutrition a great deal, and he pointed out the harmfulness of vegetable oils. Now, you know, they went away from hydrogenated oils, the ones with the hydrogen, the solid ones. They recommended vegetable oils, but the darn trouble is, if you take vegetable oils and you heat them a little bit, they oxidize and form free radicals. Remember, free radicals are the electron that jumps out of a molecule and causes damage because it wants to get into another molecule. And the theory of aging really is related to free radicals. The best free radical test you can get is an HbA1c, the sugar test. Yeah, that's really a free radical test. If it's extremely high, you're going to age a lot quicker. Your skin looks like you're smoking. So that's really, if you know how you're aging, get an HbA1c. It's very interesting. But Ancel Keys traveled around a lot of those countries. He visited Greece and Italy and studied those nations, and you hear about the Mediterranean diet and olive oil. But it's very difficult to study. No one's really done a great detailed study of the Mediterranean diet. Certainly it is better because they allow some fat. And they describe the men in Crete, how handsome they look and good they look. But I've been there. As a matter of fact, I played a tennis tournament in Crete with the medical Olympics. And I remember being in Heraclion, Heraklon, Heraclion in Crete. But people are not quite eating this right now the way you think that they are. For example, Saudi Arabia, tremendous obesity rate. South Korea, tremendous type 2 diabetes rate. Vietnam, tremendous type 2 diabetes rate because they're eating the American food, the fast foods and the sugary foods. And they are exploding with obesity and type 2 diabetes. I mean, the food pyramid the U.S. government had years ago, what did they have? They had breads and cereals at the bottom. The thing you don't want to eat. And they had fats and oils at the top. Totally wrong. Now the pyramid's turned upside down. Although they've eliminating the period now and use MyPlate, which is a bit better, but still I think has too many dairy products and oils on there. But it is better. You know, the MyPlate is half vegetables, a quarter complex vegetables, root vegetables, potato, for example, and on the top it will have complex carbohydrates and some animal proteins. A good way to get protein is eat some nuts. If you need a snack, eat some nuts. I use that very commonly because it's got fiber in it, it's got protein in it, and the carbohydrates will be slowly absorbed because of the fiber. I always have some nuts in my car in case I get hungry. So these vegetable oils, once oxidized, they form free radicals. I recently stopped at a fast food restaurant which is being torn down, but they had the pipes cut off, and the old ones were still there. It was on a weekend, nobody was there, so I went over there, and guess what I saw? You wouldn't believe it. The pipes to drain where the fryer was were severely constricted from oxidation and crusting of the vegetable oils that we're using to the cooking, because they can't use the trans fats, but they use other types of oils now. I think a lot of them would be soybean oil. I think they're using quite a bit of, and Ecolabs cleans out the pipes of all fast food restaurants, and they quoted in that book a little bit, and they saw some of that. Matter of fact, these oxidize so readily that occasionally they have an accident where the workers cleaning things out get on fire. Yeah, or in the trucks they have these oils, a fire starts. That's well described in her book. So eventually we start exiting from the saturated fats, but I don't see anybody screaming it that we need to do this, but at least in the literature we're starting to not recommending as much. And we switch the oils, and oil consumption, which makes us very fat, has increased tremendously. And the trans fat theory was exposed in Holland by Martin Katan, K-A-T-A-N, and the Unilever company, a food company. They funded it. They gave money to fund them. So we gave hats off to Unilever company, and he studied it and hit the newspapers, and that destroyed hydrogenated oils. I mean, that information did. So that was made public. We give a hat off to the Unilever company and Martin Katan. Get rid of hydrogenated oils, which increase your LDL, reduce your good cholesterol. But again, we said it was replaced by vegetable oils, and we know that they are 100% fat, and they cause inflammation. So vegetable oils was called the phantom fat. Of our about 43,000 of our foods were found to have hydrogenated oil in them, and they're trying to label them, but they should be outlawed. When you heat these vegetable oils, they produce aldehyde and formaldehyde, and these are cancer-causing agents. So that's where that theory came along, and vegetable oils can cause cancer. Also, they found 130 volatile compounds, for example, in fried chicken. Yeah, remember, frying is oxidation. So that's the reason you want to saute with a tablespoonful of olive oil, or perhaps with water. These books of Dr. Furman, The Blood Sugar Solution, Mark Hyman, they described how to cook and what to cook. So to summarize for you, what am I trying to say today? I'm trying to say today we need to get away from the theory that fat causes vascular disease, except for the limited amount of omega-6s in the non-organic beef or fish you may be eating. So we have to watch the fat to a certain. But the major cause of vascular disease, heart disease, and cancer, sugar is a sugar feeder, frankly, is fructose, the evil twin. It's sugar. And I think these associations, the American Heart Association, the NIH, the government, the researchers, they need to get on and tell the public what caused this vascular disease. For 50 years, they've been misleading us. And I think it's time somebody stood up and took them to task on it, and that only way that we can take this obesity and chronic disease epidemic and turn it around. We can diagnose type 2 diabetes 10, 15 years before it ever occurs by running a 2-hour glucose tolerance test and checking the blood sugar and the insulin level, and you'll be diagnosed very early. Watch some of my other shows. We'll continue on this path. I enjoy speaking to you. I'm here because I love you. And I'm a wellness teacher. Look at my YouTube websites, a good 75 lectures on there. Go to Amazon Books. You can see about 17 books I published all on wellness. We love you all. Send me a book. I promise I'll read it. I'll meet you at Starbucks and discuss it with you. Wellness is my passion. And I love you all very much. Namaste. I hope you continue on our path with us. I give a monthly lecture at a Lutheran hospital. You can give us your email address. We'll tell you about it. And I wish you well. Thank you very much.